everybody. Welcome to the Cloud Security Alliance Zero Trust Summit 2024. I'm Josh Woodruff. I'm one of the co-leads within the Zero Trust Working Group, and I have the honor and privilege of moderating a panel of 4 esteemed experts here in this space. And our session that we're talking about is Zero Trust for Critical Infrastructure and Operational Technology, Protecting Critical Assets. Would love for you to each hear from each of these folks, so give them each a minute to introduce themselves. But just quickly, we've got Molly Breen, CEO and co-founder of Perigee. We've got Matthew Rogers, ICS cybersecurity expert from CISA. We've got Bryson Bort, CEO and founder of Scythe. And we've got Tom Van Norman, senior vice president at Grim. But I'd much rather they talk about themselves than me mess up their names. Molly, do you want to go ahead and start us off with your introduction?
Sure. My name is Molly, and you've said I'm the CEO and co-founder of Perigee. And essentially what Perigee does is we're an enterprise integration and automation platform, and we do a lot of work in OT environments where there's a real need to essentially connect the dots across a lot of different siloed data systems and take action with that. I'm also an IANS faculty member, and before that, I was a mathematician at the NSA.
Fantastic. Thank you, Molly. Matthew, please.
Thank you, Josh. So I'm Matthew Rogers. I lead our Secure by Design for Operational Technology initiative here at CISA. So as part of the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, our role is helping to secure both the federal civilian and executive branch side of the government, but also private critical infrastructure from attacks from threat actors. Prior to this, I was building detection and security monitoring systems on serial data bus networks for planes, trains, and tanks. So very specific to the transportation sector, but hopefully can provide some of that insight into zero trust there.
Fantastic. Thank you, Matthew. Bryson, please.
Founder and CEO of Scythe, next generation threat emulation platform, which also unifies IT and OT risk assessments. I'm the co-founder of a 501c3 nonprofit called the ICS Village. Yes, that ICS Village with Tom Van Norman. I'm also a senior technical advisor at the Institute for Security and Technology, and I serve on the Cyber Science Advisory Board at West Point.
And Tom, best for last.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tom Van Norman. I'm a senior vice president at Grim, where I run the ICS practice line of business. I'm also, as Bryson mentioned, the other co-founder of the ICS Village. I've been working in control systems now for a couple decades, and enjoy talking about and deploying zero trust technologies.
Fantastic. What a privilege to have you guys together. So thank you so much for your time. I'm sure our audience is going to get a ton of value out of this. So let's get right into it. I wanted to start us off with kind of the human-centered design themes. It's a big deal, especially in operational technology. Perhaps we start off with a question around really how, relating to zero trust, how can zero trust principles be adapted to respect the operational realities of OT environments? And Matthew, I know you've written a lot of papers and write-ups about this. Would love for you to start us off.
Sure. I think on the human-centered design front, right, like to try and make things more usable. I mean, the core issue that we see in OT time and time again is either there's legacy hardware, and that makes it so that new security stuff can't work for zero trust, or we have operational constraints, right? It's a large scale distributed environment. And so good luck getting that password change, good luck getting some sort of multi-factor authentication working on that plant floor. And so we've seen a lot of challenges there. From a human-centered design standpoint, I think that the challenge is usually that human-centered design is very much at the product level of like, how do we make this product easy to use for the engineer, but is not often at the cybersecurity level, right? So it's not often saying, how do we make the cybersecurity more usable? It's saying, how do we make the product more usable? And sometimes those teams aren't as tied together as you would like. So to give an example, we've seen products before in OT environments that have made it really easy to connect your Active Directory in your IT environment to every single device in your OT environment. From a security perspective, we'd probably not recommend that. But that's just how from a usability perspective, that's ideal. So I think really how I see some of these human design elements with zero trust is more of a challenge to the community of how can we make some of the security elements easier to use, So that, I mean, these operational challenges are always going to be a thing for OT. So how can we actually move past some of them and work through them with a understanding of current operator workflows? And I think that's the piece that's missing right now to actually get zero trust working.
That's great. Does anybody else want to contribute to that? I did have a statistic I thought was relevant. What was it? 52% of ICS facilities have documented incident response plans as one example of, I mean, how do you respond if you want to talk about responding to incidents and having zero trust focusing on reducing the blast radius? If we don't have incident response plans, how will the humans expect to act? I mean, I found that to be fascinating. But anybody else, please, on this human-centered design, would love to hear from any of you.
Well, Josh, I'm going to jump in, and I think that statistic is a little misleading. So I just did 2 tabletop exercises on site at 2 manufacturing facilities. And what it comes out in those, again, I think really anchors to the problem we're talking about, which I don't think we have a technology problem. We have a human problem. And what we're facing right now is the convergence with the Active Directory example that Matthew gave, of where we have IT technologies and we have an IT team because of the cybersecurity exposure that's now saying, okay, we need to come in there and we need to be a part of that. And you have folks, and I'm going to use Tom because Tom talked about his decades of experience, saying, we've been doing this for years. Why do we need you? What are you doing here? And how are you not going to make things harder or worse or break something? One of my aphorisms that I throw around a lot is, hackers are lazy. The best hackers in the world are employees when you get in their way and they break something. You create a control that prevents me from doing what I need to do, I'm going to circumvent it, and I'm going to be mad at you at the same time, putting everything way back. And so this is the threat of zero trust implementation, is how do we not break something while trying to secure and make it better? And so that 52% stat, again, why I think that's misleading from this tabletop exercise that I did, because we have corporate coming in and then you have the local plant. And the local plant has its own IT team and its team that's actually running production on the floor. And corporate was discovering and learning things about how things worked and what was documented. And the fundamentals to everything is, what assets do I have? And it's not like we don't know the assets we have. It's who knows those assets. How are those assets centrally available to drive these processes and procedures like incident response? And so I would argue that plant probably has an incident response plan, but the person who responded on behalf of the corporation in IT somewhere in an office didn't know about it.
I'm sure we're going to get into this when we talk a little bit more about implementation and like things like the importance of monitoring. But I could give a million examples, but of sometimes how these teams don't connect. But I'm thinking of one manufacturing plant that I was speaking to recently that does have monitoring capabilities at the site. Just the OT team didn't know. They literally never even heard of the company before. Well, there's a lot of benefits in sharing those insights, but there's an element of, even, I think a lot of people assume, to your point, that it's not being tracked, and it's actually like it can be being tracked. It's just not. It may not be being shared. But anyway.
I found another terrifying statistic recently. It was, I think, the latest Dragos report. About 70% of successful OT attacks come in from IT. It's kind of important, I think, for IT and OT to be interacting and collaborating. One of the reasons I'm moderating this panel today is we recently published a paper. It's end of October. It's out there now. Zero Trust Guidance for Critical Infrastructure, focused on OT and ICS. JJ Manella and I are the 2 co-leads for the paper. And one of the key themes we try to express, and that you guys are all talking about, is collaboration is key. And I just don't think it's prevalent enough, not only just for awareness, but what tools do we have, to your point about knowing who knows where the assets are and who knows what we're using to monitor. So I think that's something we could really improve on.
One nice thing about zero trust, one of the things I always talk about when I'm going to a planner or talking to a customer, is being a default deny all right from the start, right? So we know who's going to access it. We know what physical people, what controllers, what HMIs, all of that stuff. We control the entire environment. We also go and we'll discover all of our assets. And one of the big things that we always run into is we don't know what's on the network. We don't know what's out there. How can we control something if we don't have the knowledge of what we're trying to control? So one of the nice things about zero trust that I found, whether it's a hardware device or software device, whatever you're deploying, is you're going to know what's on your network. You're going to know what's talking to what, the different protocols, the different users, and all that stuff. Because in an OT environment, you may not know. These things are designed to run for 15, 20 years, decade long. And that knowledge of your networks and what needs to work, those people might be long gone. So once you do install this technology, you can now go and lock it down. You can see, you can learn a lot about your network. You can also go and install, an IDS or an IPS and things like that, and pull that data out, analyze that data.
Thank you, Tom. I know safety being such a paramount concern within OT really challenges some of the norms that we do in IT with operator lockout, for instance. IT user lockout versus operator lockout. You talk about a risk of human life, locking somebody out of an operational technology infrastructure. Matthew, I was curious, just because I know you've gotten so much in this space and a great thought leader out there around human-centered design in OT. How does your work at CISA inform human-centered design in OT security?
So, part of this is we're doing voice of customer research ourselves. So one of the core programs we're working on right now is we're trying to do voice of customer research to understand why people don't authenticate traffic in OT. This is a fun one of technically that there have been secure communication solutions in OT environments for a decade now, between like a Modbus over TLS, DMP3 Secure, OPC UA. All of these solutions technically exist. How usable are they? Have operators decided to use them are two separate questions, right? So we're currently doing voice of customer research to actually work with operators and get a root trust understanding of what are the actual divides here. Because to Bryson's point, right, like from a technical side, from like putting on my old IT monitoring hat, like I can tell you why these things are difficult to use or why PKI infrastructure kind of sucks to get going in an OT environment. But I can't tell you what the operator's concerns are unless I actually go down and talk to them and do interviews and get an understanding. Because this is really a team divide, right? Like we can't, in my view, have a solution that relies on cyber expertise in the operator level. These folks are really smart. They're talented engineers, but we need solutions that just work at a level that they are used to and exist within their operational workflows. Because we're all busy. There's only so many hats we can add on, right? Short of, Bryson with your 4 different groups I think you have going on right now. But it's a lot of the challenge right now is just actually getting to the ground truth of these problems and talking to the real people doing it. So that's where we're leading from CISA's end.
It's a fascinating fact that you pointed out, Matthew, around the encrypted industrial protocols exist. I think I continually hear, and you guys know more than I, but unencrypted protocols being one of the biggest vulnerabilities and the biggest risk in industrial control systems. But I also know, yeah, please go ahead.
Let's not get myself in too much trouble here before I get yelled at. What I'm really focused on is authenticated communications, right? So I want the ability to say this device sent this message, and we have some way of signing that information and verifying the authenticity of the sender. I don't really care about encrypted communications as much in OT. It's kind of a nice to have, but is much higher risk of breaking things, right? So you can think about it this way. If you authenticate traffic, if you add like an HMAC or something afterwards, if that certificate is invalid and breaks, you can still read the traffic. You understand what's going on. It's going to throw an alert. You can silence an alert and everything will keep working in an operational setting. If you encrypt everything and that breaks, you just can't read the communication anymore. And so I think there's some nuances to how we think about, this is the age-old example of confidentiality in OT environments. There's ways to make this stuff usable and get a lot of the security benefits. Not to say that confidentiality isn't important in OT, but we're currently starting at nothing. So how do we improve it by adding authentication even is where I want to get to.
Yeah, we only have so many resources: time, money, people, attention, because it starts with leadership. Zero trust is a principle, not a religion, right? We apply it as much as it helps make us more secure. And I really like that Matthew pushed back on the encrypted comms, because we have a challenge where there is a risk to employing something like that. For anybody in the IT world who has ever seen an MFA rollout, you know how much goes wrong. And even when things go right, you know how much it irritates you and gets in your way. We don't have that luxury in operational technology. Hence, most of the focus that I've seen in the industry really is in two phases. One, IT's coming in and is a part of the asset discovery. Again, not that we didn't know that those assets were there, but that having that control or automations engineer with that team and having it in that spreadsheet doesn't help us to understand an overall system of systems and an architectural exposure, as well as what we need to do to be able to grow that. And then the second phase is we mostly know what we got enough. How do we establish a secure architecture, which is reducing impact, establishing those control zones and those conduits, and then more importantly, where IT can come into that, where those established monitoring points, because those are now the choke points in north-south and east-west traffic. But it comes down to relationships. It starts with leadership buy-in, and then it starts with team going and building that collaborative trust and collaboration to actually, I said collaborative collaboration, but that's how important it is. You need to collaborate twice. Because if you don't, they're not gonna buy into it. I've seen this so many times where you have these change projects go in, and when the champion leaves, it goes away, and we can't afford that and to have that done. And I'll close with one case study that I've seen where I had a team ask me to review their architectural documentation. They've been trying for a year and a half to get, and this is the IT team coming to OT. They've been trying to deploy this architectural plan, and it wasn't working. And they were kind of like, well, maybe there's something technically wrong that we're not getting. And I asked them, I was like, well, have you talked to the operations team? Oh yeah, we met with the leader who runs all of the thing for North America, and we told her what we were trying to do. And I was like, oh, so you told somebody who actually is revenue driving and is a very senior person, you told her what you were going to do, and you were surprised that you didn't get a positive response and that your project remains fallow. Did you ever ask her what her priorities were? Because that's where it starts. Where are the operational priorities that we can come in, and by supporting them and drafting them, we can get some of what we need, as opposed to just trying to come in and drop in, here's the textbook zero architecture solution.
You know, Bryson, to follow up on that, it is also going to change per vertical, per company, per, you know, there's many different variables in there. You can take a local water plant, going to have different priorities and technology you're going to install compared to a large city wastewater plant or water plant, right? So when we talk about authentication or encryption, the encryption part just completely scary. But you talk about the authentication part. Who maintains this stuff? Who's going to deploy it? Their purpose, those technologists' purpose, if they even have an IT person, is to make gas flow in that line or make those widgets, or, you know, that they have a job already. Now we're putting in new technology. Now we're putting in new things. So one of the things I hear an awful lot, you know, working with technology is, well, they should just do this. It's easy, you know, or that technology already exists. Well, you're right. It does already exist, you know, for Modbus over TLS and stuff like that. That does exist. Who's going to do it? So your workforce also has to have that knowledge. You have to have an experienced workforce to deploy the things. How do we make it easier to deploy? And is that really the right thing for the company? Maybe the company doesn't need anything. Maybe the company needs something to collaborate. So understanding the needs of the company and the business is also extremely important.
No, resilience, uptime, and availability is more critical in OT environments than IT. Well, it's critical in IT too, but I think could cause more catastrophic impacts when you have downtime. And just kind of open question to all of you around these things are available, and you need leadership and you need expertise. how much of a factor does maintenance windows come into play here? Like, how much room do you guys see the people that you're working with be able to take some downtime to implement a new thing, or implement a new thing without any downtime, or attempting to have no downtime? What's the feasibility and reality of that situation, even if they did want to implement something like device authentication?
I mean, I'll jump in. Mandatory. That's not even a question. This isn't a debate. That is what it is. You meet that window. In addition, not only do you have the window of when maintenance is, you have the architectural limitations in that environment. So I've seen this in a few asset discovery projects where the routing infrastructure, because I want to put in a span port or a tap to be able to pull the information off, well, that switch is 25 years old. It had 4 ports. There's no additional ports. I can't like just add a port on. So I am stuck with what the core infrastructure is, which is archaic. And that's what it is. So not only is it the window, it's what the limitations of what's there.
I'll add on to that as well, right? We've seen when there is an incident and there's a crisis and somebody then has to go and try and replace some of that older equipment. Like a real challenge can be that because of all of the FATSAT, factory acceptance tests, systems acceptance tests, when you're going back to that safety certification, you might feel obligated to replace it with the stuff that you used to have that worked. And then you end up with just the same old equipment again. And so you can really get yourself in kind of a cycle here where, well, you had money to do upgrades or do cybersecurity, then you had an incident, and well, now all of that money is replacing it with the same old stuff that you had before. And so there needs to be some level of foreplanning or preemptive safety approvals, things like that, so that you can actually take advantage of both downtime windows, but also if there's a good crisis and you need to upgrade something and get things working quickly, how much you can actually test that on like a side environment. It really just depends on the resources of your organization, but like that's kind of the ideal scenario.
I'll take it in a slightly different direction. So your question was about downtime. And a lot of times like downtime is the opposite of uptime, and we're talking about it in this very binary situation. When I'm working with a lot of these manufacturing plants, the point of uptime is to be able to get to accessibility of the data. Like their higher purpose, like, and I think it was Bryson that used the word revenue. Their higher purpose is to like understand how much product they made, understand how much waste they had, like being able to forecast demand and meet said demand. Like those are all the challenges that they're thinking about. And being able to access the data from these systems becomes really important. And this kind of relates back to this idea of, or like what we're talking about with respect to zero trust and like how do we adapt it? Because it's not only about how are we talking about it from this like device to device perspective, but like how enabling the users also to continue to be able to get the information that they need in a real-time way without slowing them down. And that's been another big theme that just want to make sure we touched on, that uptime isn't only in service of just like making things, but there's all these other components that these businesses are thinking about.
I'm learning so much from talking to you guys already. I hope everyone else is too. It's great. Talking about zero trust, one of the main principles of the strategy is segmentation, micro-segmentation specifically, or maybe in the case of OT, as John Kindervag may describe it as a micro perimeter, where you're walling off physical assets, not maybe with a network boundary, but with a physical boundary with some access or identity protections. But just thinking about zero trust as modern segmentation, how does zero trust differ from network segmentation in OT environments? Like how is that? How do you apply segmentation, the zero trust principle of segmentation, into operational technology environments? How does it translate?
I'll take that. So I've deployed zero trust technology in several plants now already, several environments. The one really nice thing about it, great selling point, where to put it in perspective for people that normally do not interact with the technology, understand, is you're making it harder for your adversary with the microsegmentation, right? So you're controlling your lateral movement, your east, west, north, and south. You take a traditional firewall, you're in control for the most part. What's coming in and leaving your network. With the microsegmentation, I'm replacing that piece of hardware. I'm putting an agent on a computer, whatever technology that you're deploying, and now I'm more granularly controlling that flow of traffic. I'm more granularly saying device A can talk to device B over certain ports or services or whatever. So when you go and you talk to end users or asset owners rather, and you explain that, it's not just from a security point of view, it's also from a network resilience. Now we filter out all the other stuff that should not be there. Maybe you have legitimate traffic on a network, but the NIC card on the computer went bad, or something else. Somebody plugged in a device on that network, wasn't nefarious. Things just happen. Now, when you deploy this technology, it doesn't matter that they did that, because the rules in the technology that you deployed won't allow it to get to those critical assets. So, it has a security feature on it, but it also has a network resilience, and that seems to work best for me when I explain it to asset owners. Is, hey, security is a real thing, but it's also you're making your network more reliable, it's more resilient. It's working now, because when you hit that start or stop button on an HMI, or you need to change the set points, it needs to happen. You could be, you bring health, life, and safety into everything here, where the IO needs to talk to that controller, whatever the case may be. It needs to happen. So if you can filter out all the other garbage on your network and only allow that traffic through, your network becomes more reliable.
Yeah, I'll jump on what Tom said there. So what we're talking about, because we can't defend the endpoints directly, we can't establish the authentication because that requires encrypted protocols to make it useful. And so primarily what we're doing is we're working the routing of traffic around it. So there's 3 levels of threat proximity. The internet, which we're all familiar with and has been the game changer. Physical, which we typically already have for the most part, where these things are in a controlled environment. The caveat to that is where some industrial control systems are in remote locations. And then you have the middle ground of proximate radio frequencies, i.e., can I shoot Bluetooth a mile away? Can I sniff your Wi-Fi? And so physical access for the most part, let's put that to the side. RF is a special case. We're primarily talking about the internet access. Josh, you quoted the statistic from Dragos that 70% of attacks come from IT into OT. That's what I teach, because think about it. What's the purpose of IT? To be out there on the internet, tied directly to the threat. Come in, pivot, crossover, because let's all be clear, there is no actual air gap from IT into OT, because there can't be. And then the second is, which gets the occasional press article, and somebody pulls Shodan or Census and says, there's 80,000 industrial dishwashers online, and oh my gosh, we're all going to die. That's the direct exposure. That's a core hygiene component of, I just need to be controlling my exposure there. Now, here's something I always like to point out to folks in IT that blows their mind. You have third parties contractually always coming into your OT environment. Those vendors, those manufacturers have mandated access. Some of it's physical, most of it is internet-related access. So they are hopefully, and I'm phrasing it hopefully because we don't always have that under control or have a shared service there, VPNing in, tunneling in, and then how do we control and monitor that session that's coming in? So those are our 2 main access points that are coming in for north-south. Now, I've not really seen microsegmentation in OT, but there's certainly a lot of forms of segmentation, again, to what Tom talked about, that are all around the traffic of around the device. So at the highest level, we have software-defined networking, where I can just control routing with a control plane. And then we start getting down into, where do I establish actual segments? And that can be anything from a firewall to a switch with a VLAN to a CDN to a data diode, which is enforcing one-way communications. Like, there are a number of different things based on what the operational requirement is, because communication is still necessary. It's where, as Tom said, can I restrict traffic, bring those choke points, and then more importantly, because again, another simplistic component. I don't think people realize there are only two technical controls in any environment: preventative and detective. What can I stop? What can I see? And very little of it is going to be what can I stop? Most of it is going to be what can I control to be able to see, because visibility is what establishes human response to kick off detection, response, and recovery.
And to build on Bryson's point there, right? Like OT has some inherent benefits for that continuous monitoring and detection, because if you have some level of segmentation, like the more repetitive process controls, the lack of like user data and the chaos of people actively trying to reach out to that open internet all the time gives you some benefits. Now, of course, like no environment is perfectly clean. And so it's not always that pretty picture, coming from the transportation background. Sometimes it was the pretty picture because that plane didn't really talk to the open internet on the serial bus, let me tell you, had it the easy way. But I think the remote connection from the vendor piece is really interesting because, we always talk about segmentation kind of along the same lines as that air gap connection, but we are like actively welcoming in a lot more external connections into the environment. And to put on my CISA secure design hat, because I simply must, I think that this is one of those areas where it's a real challenge, because if you're a smaller operator and you have one of those 24/7 vendor remote connections, you might just kind of have to take it because it's required for your operational business use cases. And if there aren't any security controls directly on, say, like the controller that is being connected to, you might have a lot of difficulty actually providing some sort of zero trust layered network detection. And at least from the CISA end, right, like we repeatedly see people get segmentation wrong. I don't care if it's IT, I don't care if it's OT. It's like a really easy thing to screw up. That's just kind of how it is. And so if you're a smaller player, I think this is where some of the secure by design impetus comes from, of how can we make it easier to have sort of a defense in depth approach for some of these devices? Because if you're going to start mandating more and more remote connections, you have to have some security or some reliance built in that if segmentation fails, you have another option. And some of that might be continuous monitoring and detection. Some of that might be like an identity and authentication base. Some of them might be logging on the host device itself. Right? There's a lot of options. It just makes sure that those options exist.
Wonderful. Thank you. It's interesting. Another stat that was really shocking to me: of 80% of all ICS vulnerabilities are deep within the ICS networks. They're living off the land type things that ideally a segmentation strategy may have prevented at least that lateral movement and that spread. And with that, I wonder, just kind of another question around, I do want to get to secure by design, Matthew, because it's a topic I definitely want to chat about. But a little bit further on the segmentation, Tom talked about really networking and firewalls, really layer 3, maybe even up to layer 7, but probably more realistically in OT, a layer 3 type. But you get to these lower levels of the Purdue model and the process control zones where it's just completely flat networks. It's very hard to do segmentation, right? And especially when you've got so many proprietary protocols down there, keeping the things running. Our paper talks about a few different approaches to even data diodes and some other OT specific gateways. But just for you guys, from what you're doing and seeing out there, what are the most significant capability gaps in preventing zero trust adoption in OT systems?
Secure comms, logging, any sort of identity foundation. Those are my top 3. Look, all things that are really difficult to implement in OT, but if a device can't uniquely identify itself, if it can't authenticate to some sort of SCADA controller as like basically saying when configuration changes should actually occur versus when somebody over the network just sent a DMP3 write packet, like you're in for a world of hurt, right? Like I have jokingly refer to this as sort of the bubble boy method of cybersecurity. Of like, if there aren't more security controls built into the OT environment, your main security control is always going to be segmentation, because all of these legacy protocols have so many built-in mechanisms for compromising the OT system. You don't need anything fancy. I mean, if your goal is denial of service, pretty much every OT protocol has a built-in safety mechanism to just turn everything off. Like it's by design, right? And so if you're just trying to do that, you need a lot more security controls to be built into the OT environment. Otherwise, you're always going to be relying on segmentation as the primary control. Segmentation is a good idea regardless, But I think long term, I don't know how sustainable that is going to be, particularly with these things like 24/7 vendor connections, more folks interconnecting to the cloud. Like the connections will persist, right? The revenue drivers are too present for that to not be the case.
The challenge, a couple of challenges that I've had recently was actually on the business end. Budgets. Why should I do it? What's it going to bring? My job is to run that stamping mill or that water plant. What are you talking about? Why do I even need this? Those are the questions that I'm getting. We're not even talking about PLC communication, because since we do, I completely lose that person, whether they're the CISO or the IT manager or whoever it is. Those conversations don't even come up. It's all right. We have this small maintenance window. We have this much money. We have this stuff here. Oh yeah, and by the way, show me it works. Those are the questions that I'm getting. And why do I need it? Show me who's been attacked or when's been attacked. And there's so many different reports. We mentioned the Jaggers report earlier. Great resource. But show me the attacks. My job is to run this stamping plant or this water plant. Who got attacked? So it's when you go off security, you're probably not going to go and win that argument. You go off resilience, you stand a better chance. It's going to make my network more resilient.
I was also able to win this argument recently. Resilience is definitely a part of it, but it was with a manufacturer that had these scan guns that were, like tracking boxes and stuff as they were leaving the warehouse. And these scan guns were notorious for changing networks all the time. And they never had any type of visibility into when these scan guns were changing networks. Things were going down all the time. They were so fed up with these scan guns. So coming in as a security player and monitoring the scan guns, increasing the reliability of the network connections and like isolating them to certain pieces, not only had the benefits towards microsegmentation and these things that we're talking about within OT environments, but also had a larger impact. I guess resilience is a part of it, but they actually did see direct value in like, oh, now we can, I don't know, count things better. What folks do on the business side with things coming out of the warehouse. One of the other things I was going to chime in on around this lack of capabilities with the things that Matthew said, it seems like there's like a higher order thing to be thinking about just around like, we've talked a lot about vendors as they pertain to people accessing the sites, but there's also like the vendors of the devices. And it seems like, how incentivized are they to building in these different capabilities for these devices and the limited support coming from that side, or sometimes limited support?
It's leadership. And there's two kinds of leadership. Leadership cares about security. Leadership doesn't care about security. And the starting point that we have to understand as practitioners, because all of us have experienced this frustration of beating our head against the wall for the best effort. And we keep wondering, why don't they get it? Why doesn't this change? And once you recognize that there are these two kinds of leadership, you can explain it. Because the one that cares about security and the one that doesn't care about security, it's not they don't care about security. It's that the focus and investment is only with compliance, because compliance is the existential foundation that allows me to operate my business. That's what I need. Security is a nice to have. Compliance is mandatory. I can't not be compliant. And so the point there is, once you realize what kind of leadership you have, that's going to explain their priorities, that's going to explain their budget, and that's going to explain where you need to start from to be able to work that. On that note, the other thing I will point to is we learn a lot as we grow up in our careers about how to manage our team, and some of us learn how to manage our boss. That's only two aspects of management. The other is with your peers. And by the way, when I'm talking about your peers, I'm talking about your peers outside of security. Those are the allies where you can gain the knowledge. And again, don't go in telling your peer, build a relationship of mutual respect and communication and sharing information. And now you build a groundswell of an ally to change that. Final point, besides the fact that I talked about the vendor communications earlier, that's an easy win, because the folks that are managing that today on the floor, they don't care how it's done. In fact, for most of them, it's a pain in the butt. So you taking that, as long as you provide a good service, is a win-win. The other one, because going back to compliance, everybody has to have disaster recovery and business continuity planning. That's another area where if you can figure out how to draft into that, there is already leadership attention and resources available that you can work with.
Okay, speaking of resilience, I know we brought that up, and I want to touch on this briefly. I know, just being mindful of time, I do want to get to secure by design, but from a resilience perspective, just a quick question to ask the group for some of your feedback and what you're seeing out there. One question could be, what metrics should we use to evaluate whether a security control is worth the operational impact?
Is that a question of whether I should deploy the control or the efficacy of the control? Or both?
It could be either or. Yes. I mean, how do you know? And it's kind of back to the human design, but it's you want a security control, but you don't want to impact the resilience. You don't want to impact the operations, but you need to protect and defend. What metrics do you use to figure out what's worth it and what's not worth it?
Okay. Well, I'm going to let Matthew take that because he's wearing a blazer, which feels really PowerPoint, and that just speaks metrics to me.
It's got the metrics.
I wasn't even going the metrics answer. I should have worn a hoodie. So I mean, I think my answer is much more around that like operational use case. So like Molly's example, I think is perfect of, okay, do they really care about the security of those like scanners? Not really, probably, but they really cared once those things just started working better. And like I can give examples from my own background. We were at one point tasked to work on a large mass transit entity, and we showed up and we sell ourselves as like a security product, and we start like analyzing the data, and we look at the existing like PDFs and things that they're analyzing, and they're not great. And so we just started providing data insights to them that helped the operators do their like normal safety compliance tasks. And suddenly they loved us. They didn't care about the security outcomes. Might have been an insurance write-off, but like they really cared about increasing their own operational use cases, right? So if you can tie those things together, you're always going to get a win. I think a lot of the human-centered design points are really more focused around taking the question and saying, like, how can I reduce that set of friction or that operational impact in the first place? So it's saying like, we know it's a problem. Let's study how we can reduce that. And otherwise, it's always got to be threat centric, right? Like if you know there's a big enough threat coming that you really need to cause some sort of operational impact, it's a really hard conversation. Like from CISA, I would point to some of this Vault Typhoon stuff that's coming down the pipe. Like there are advanced actors trying to get into the OT network. Maybe segmentation becomes more of a priority, and you need to prioritize some level of downtime where you work on that instead of patching something else. But that's always going to be a really hard conversation.
Another theme I wanted to introduce or talk about was design and architecture, specifically around secure by design. One question to kick off that topic is, what are the unique challenges of implementing secure by design in process control zones?
So I started the last one. Bryson, do you want to take this? Because I know you brought up the unique challenges of secure by design piece, and then I can talk to some of it. Up to you. I don't want to hog too much of the conversation.
I think you nailed it really well at the beginning, where you talked about the product focus versus when I took my note, I called it the architectural focus, right? We have a system view for the user, and then we have a system of systems problem. Turns out the risk here is the interconnected nature of these things. Again, going back to proximate risk models, they're connected. That's, there it is. There's the beef.
Yeah. And I think the reason why, so secure by design is an initiative, right? It's been a thing for almost 2 years now at CISA, came out of national cybersecurity strategy. I mean, there's kind of two main components, but the driving impetus is we see the same vulnerabilities time and time again. How do we kind of stop the flood? Because right now, all of our security budgets are just kind of making a, X equals Y straight line up diagonally, but that can't be sustainable forever. And so how do we actually shift some of that burden to make it so that we get more secure products in the first place? Because everybody assumes that their products are secure when they buy them. At least non-cybersecurity professionals do. And so, I mean, the core theme for me and the core driver for secure by design for OT actually came out of a conversation I had with some rail operators, an increasingly regulated industry. And their main concern was, hey, I keep being pressured and told that cybersecurity is a real problem for my industry. I'm buying a bunch of new components, like we're doing rip and replace operations. It's really expensive. Is somebody from the government going to come down, or some security consultant going to come down 10 years later and tell me all the stuff I bought 10 years ago is a legacy network? right? Like we're just going to call it a legacy foundation again, because when you deployed it, it was just using the same old insecure protocols because it was connected to other legacy networks. And so we never truly got any upgrades. Like in theory, that device might have more secure capabilities. It might have more CPU compute, so it could actually do some of the authentication, do some of the secure communications, or might be able to do some of the logging, but it just didn't because it wasn't turned on by default and none of the other stuff did. And so a lot of the secure by design piece is A, that default configuration, but B, trying to take the idea of OT and saying like, well, we don't do all these things right now because of legacy challenges and operational challenges, and saying like, can we make it so that we can drive demand from the asset owner side to get cybersecurity to actually exist in some of these products. So if you wanted to buy a new secure device, you don't have to be in the oil and natural gas sector. So that if you're just like a water sector entity and you want a defense in depth security control on the device to do like MFA because you know it's super critical and you maybe don't want to deploy it everywhere, but it's got to exist somewhere because you don't trust your segmentation. Like that should be an option without you having to pay an arm and a leg or having to design your entire architecture around buying the one PLC that supports MFA, right? Like this gets very expensive very quickly, and it doesn't really account for operator error or the fact that with these things having 20-year life cycles, it's super easy to make a mistake in the planning stage if cybersecurity is fundamentally embedded in that planning and is difficult to shift afterwards. So secure by design is trying to get the asset owner demand, but I mean, fundamentally, to Bryson's point about leadership, right? Secure by design is trying to pressure leadership decisions to say that, you know, security is a trade-off. You're going to spend 2 weeks on security instead of some new fancy feature. So how do we, you know, incentivize folks to do that? But also, how do we give teeth to the product security folks in these organizations and help them make that argument? Because, like Bryson said, like we've all been banging our head on these problems for a very long time. I think sometimes secure by design gets interpreted as like, hey, folks who are doing product security right now, like you're not doing a good job. When in reality, all of these things are way more complicated than that. There's business drivers that are preventing folks from getting a lot of the stuff that they would want to get done actually getting done, or there's operational concerns. And so secure by design is fundamentally about trying to give those organizations the resources and the lines of argument they need to help make security be a priority. And then on the government side, I mean, we're trying to drive the demand signal to help them actually make that. You know, sans regulation, we're just trying to put pressure on all ends so that we can actually, in 10 years, hopefully that operator isn't saying, yeah, I bought a bunch of legacy products, my bad. It doesn't actually, we're not in a better state than we were. Because I think the default state is kind of everybody blaming each other and us not really moving forward as an industry, just because there's so many problems in the space.
And Molly, you said something earlier about the manufacturers' incentives really they're incentivized to create products that work. They're OEMs. Are you seeing any developments in the software space or the product space that can complement or offset this to enhance the secure by design principle, even though the supply chain may be lacking incorporating security concerns?
Oh, interesting. So your question is asking, like software on the supply chain side or software on the security side?
I don't know if you're seeing security products to fulfill any end of that spectrum, anything to kind of make up for the lack of secure by design in typical OT equipment.
Yeah. One of the big things that I'm excited by is it seems like software is getting a lot better at being less rigid. Like more software is better at being flexible. Just given the way that we've all evolved and learned that like my environment is not the same as your environment, and this software should not be like a total black box in how it operates. And I think that then becomes really helpful for secure by design, because one of the things that's hard about it is it's hard to facilitate consistent security policies across inconsistent devices. But if you can use some of these new tools that that enable a little bit more customization, not just for your environment, but customization like within your environment across different functional areas where there might be different types of priorities. I'm seeing that a lot more on the security side as like a way of adapting to, hey, we're not going to be able to replace everything overnight, but there are certain things that we can do with the things that we can't replace.
Well, this has been absolutely fantastic. I know I've learned a bunch. I'm sure our audience has learned a bunch as well from all of you experts. So thank you to all of our outstanding panelists, as well as for all of you joining us here in our session. I hope you're enjoying the Zero Trust Summit. And at this point, you've got another about half day left. So enjoy the rest of the summit, and thank you so much for your time. Bye, guys.